The Euthyphro Dilemma. Here's another way to say it. Is X good because God wills it? That's, if you think of a dilemma, they have two horns. It's a dilemma, die in the sense of two. So the first horn of the dilemma would be, is X good because God wills it to be good? Well, and if that's it, then the problem is then it's arbitrary. God can just issue these arbitrary commands for good things, sure, but also for bad things. Or two, the second horn of the dilemma, does God will X because it is already good? Well, the problem with that one is that, well, if it's already good, like having God to will something that's already good seems superfluous. Why would you need God to tell you what to do if it's independent, as it says in parentheses? It's independent of God. So let me show you the way it looks here. It's really a question of direction of causation. Okay, horn one is the good because God wills it to be good, right? So you see in the diagram, the direction of causation would be from God to good. God is prior or primary, and then what is good gets called good because God just says it's good. Okay. Obviously, again, the problem is that that's arbitrary. Like, what if God's like, so let's take a modern day example. All right, like donating money. Let's say you wanted to donate money. Okay. And obviously you think that's a good thing. So like you're donating to some charity or something like that, right? So is what you're doing good? Yes, let's assume. Is what you're doing good because God said it's good? Well, the problem is, as with horn one, is that God could say also the opposite. He could say that he could just, if goodness is dependent upon God, then God could say that stealing money is good, and now that's good instead. Or horn two, right? Horn two says that goodness is prior, and then God is dependent upon that goodness in some way, in the sense of good is good because it's just good. It's just independently good. And then God sort of just recognizes or affirms that goodness or ratifies that goodness in some respect. Well, the problem with that is like, well, why do we need God? I could just, as a human being, maybe determine what is good independent of God. If it's something that's like independently able to be determined, right? Like I can just like sort of think about, like I can just take that unnecessary step out. Like why even need God in that sense? So again, and it's going to be superfluous. So let me run you through a few responses to this, and feel free to stop me at any time because this can get really confusing. Okay, so I'll try to answer to as many questions about this as I can. So the responses look like this, all right? And there are 5 major responses to this, given the horns. Like you have to remember what the horns are. So horn 1 is where God is prior, and then God says what's good. Of course, that could also be, he could just say like torturing babies is good. And now it's good because God said it. Or horn 2, where goodness is prior, right? So just remember which horn is which. If you need to, write it down or just come back to this section of the video. Okay, so the 5 major responses are this. You have classical theism, which splits the horns. I'll say what that means in a second, but they're going to just reject that there's a dilemma at all. You have 2, which is a modified divine command theory. The idea that here the strategy is to accept horn 1, but add some qualifications. So number 3 is moral realism, but it's moral realism apart from God. So this would be number 3, 4, and 5 are actually secular responses, and 1 and 2 are more Christian responses or religious responses. So number 3 begins the so-called secular responses. So this number 3 response would just affirm that morality is real, and they would just accept horn 2. They would say back here, just move back a slide, they'd say, yeah, goodness is real. That again, number 3 is moral realism. Goodness, morality is real on horn 2, and we don't need God. Like, so they're just going to discard the superfluous element. So number 4 is an interesting one. It's interesting. Well, it's not uncommon because this is one that many people take, but it's interesting to see it in discussion with the Euthyphro Dilemma. So basically as a response to the Euthyphro Dilemma. So let me just say what it is first. So moral constructivism or relativism, we're all very familiar with relativism, the idea that morality just is relative to an individual or relative to a culture, and whatever that individual says or whatever that culture says is what is morally good or bad, okay? So this actually accepts horn one, but it's going to be kind of a different answer that Euthyphro gives. It's, instead of talking about the divine, right, it's going to say that the humans are the ones that say what is good. So interestingly, it's not one that gets brought up, but since that viewpoint is so common, it's worth mentioning here. And then five, evolutionary ethics and naturalism. We'll discuss that as we get to it, but the idea here is I don't really know if it sort of answers the dilemma at all. It just sort of sees it not as a problem. It's more similar to the constructivist or relativist account in my. So let's keep going. So number one, splitting the horns. This is the classical theist response, and we're going to have to save it because I think it's the best response. You probably could have guessed that if you know a little bit about me and have seen some of my videos, but we're going to save it because I think we need to struggle with the horns first before we just split them right down the middle. So let's look at number two first. Modified divine command theory. Okay, so first bullet point. This is actually not very popular among sophisticated philosophers and theologians today. Some might accept that an action is right because God commands it, but they add crucial qualifications to avoid the arbitrariness problem. Now, remember what, so this is accepting horn one with qualifications, right there, the underlined portion, right at the very top. Accepting horn one with qualifications. What was horn one? Well, God determines what is good. God is prior, and then whatever he says goes, okay? Well, they are going to accept horn one, and you can see the proponents there, but let me see, bullet point 3. The qualifications they add is that it's just impossible for God to say something arbitrary and to say that something that is evil is really good. So let me read this. While God's command define what is right, God's nature, which is necessarily good and loving, constrains what he can command. So he is constrained by what he can command. Thus, arbitrary commands like torture babies for fun are simply impossible for God. So this would accept horn one and say, yes, whatever God says, in theory, God could command something evil and it would be evil, but in practice, it's impossible for him to do so. So that's actually very similar to number one, but we'll say more about number one in a little bit. All right, number 3, moral realism. Now, we're getting into the secular responses here. So a religious person wouldn't accept these because they impugn God in some way. Obviously, accepting horn 2 impugns God and impugns God's sovereignty. It makes God less sovereign because if you're accepting horn 2, you're saying that the good is prior to and more sovereign than God, and God just kind of has to acquiesce to whatever's good. Like, yes, sir, goodness is what goodness, but this is what many secularists will take, this route. First bullet point, moral truths exist objectively, independent of human opinion, cultural conventions, and so on, or divine will. Now, I'm a moral realist, but I'm not a moral realist who's a secular moral realist. Now, I accept this definition of moral realism in that first bullet point without that underlined portion, right? So moral truths do exist objectively, agree. They do exist independent of human opinion, I agree, and cultural conventions, I agree. And it is analogous to mathematical truths and logical necessities, absolutely agree. But they do not exist independent of divine will. That's only secular philosopher would affirm that. Okay, so you can see some proponents here. Plato would be one. Kant would be another. Kant, although he was something of a Christian in his beliefs, maybe in his private beliefs, maybe he was just a nominal Christian. Haven't really looked much into it, but he is well known to have been a Christian. I haven't read his diaries or anything to see, or I don't really judge people very closely on how devout were you, have no idea. But in his philosophy, he did not really make much use of the Christian worldview in his philosophy. And so when it came to morality, he tried to establish morality independent of God. So it's just a function of rationality itself. So Kant would be there as well. So I say here, bullet point 3, this is the kicker. Many secular moral realists, again, because 3, 4, and 5 are all secular responses, many secular moral realists argue that moral facts are simply brute facts about the universe, and that they arise from the nature, or that they arise from the nature of rational beings, or maybe from considerations of well-being and flourishing, but they're just are what they are, right? They're real, and we don't know how they got here, but they're real. And so, as you can see, the main challenge here, that's a problem, because if we don't know how they got here, we have a really hard time explaining why they exist and how they exist, how these objective moral truths exist, why we should be motivated to follow them at all without a divine ground. They don't seem very enforceable. They just kind of exist. So they would have natural consequences, let's say, right? So like, let's take an example like kindness, right? Kindness is probably something I should follow and do. And that has natural consequences, sure. Like, I don't have to believe in a God telling me to be kind. And it has natural consequences in the sense that if I'm not kind to my neighbors and I'm going to be a jerk to everybody, then I'm going to suffer the consequences of that. So these might have natural consequences, but what about when it comes to other things? What about when it's like, hey, be as selfish as you want in your business dealings? Like, you might lose a few friends, but you'll be really successful. And without a divine ground to tell you, like, don't do that, then, who's to say why you shouldn't, So there are going to be certain morality, moral demands that you just shouldn't, it's not going to be very enforceable. Okay. So that was number 3. Another secular response is very, very popular, moral constructivism or relativism. Those are different views, but related for the sake of this. So what they do here is they implicitly accept horn 1, but for humanity. No God here in this picture. They say what humans decide is right is right. So first bullet point, morality is not objectively discovered, so it denies what the moral realist is saying, but it's constructed by humans, either individual or collectively, and it's good because we say it's good, not good because God says it's good. So that's the main difference. They're going to accept horn 1. Let's go back to the horns. But instead of God on that left-hand side on the horn 1, that diagram, we're just going to put humans there. Humans come prior, ontologically, and what they say is good is good. The same problem arises for us if we put humans on that left-hand side. The same problem. It's like, well, that's just arbitrary. We could say that evil things are good. We could say that punching babies in the face is good. So you can see right here, main challenge, accounting a few things, accounting for the apparent universality of moral intuitions, providing a basis for moral criticism across cultures, and avoiding nihilism. I also need to add the idea of arbitrary. It does not avoid the arbitrariness objection whatsoever. Number 5, evolutionary ethics and naturalism. So the idea here is, this is very popular as well, very common. Evolution is an evolved trait, a set of pro-social behaviors and intuitions that have been beneficial for human survival and cooperation, sure. And so that's just what morality is. But you can see the problem here is it faces the naturalistic fallacy. The idea that you're deriving an ought from what it is, right? Like, the naturalistic fallacy would say, hey, since we see homosexual behavior in the animal kingdom, then that is okay, morally speaking, for humans. That's an is-ought naturalistic fallacy, right? Because you wouldn't do the same thing you can't derive an ought from an is. Think about that same exact reasoning with respect to spiders, like black widows eating their sexual mates, right? Like, yeah, that happens in the animal kingdom as well. But, like, we shouldn't do it, right? Just because something is the case in the animal kingdom doesn't mean that we should be doing it in our situation. So all that to say, there might be other arguments to get to that ought in other ways, but you're not going to get it just straight from, hey, I observed this in nature. This is the case, and so it ought to be the case in our case. It's a total fallacy. And also, you come into a problem with respect to whether evolved behaviors are truly moral or whether they're adaptive, right? So just because behavior is adaptive doesn't mean that it's morally good, right? Again, go back to the idea of like cutthroat business behaviors. Like if I step on people, I will become really successful. And I treat people brutally. I don't even pay them severance. I just fire people left and right. I'm just a jerk to everybody around. But I am wildly successful in my business ventures, right? Like that's adaptive behavior in the sense of survival of the fittest. I'm being really, really successful. So evolutionarily speaking, that's a success. However, obviously it's not ethical behavior, and we all know it. So how do you know the difference between evolutionarily successful behavior and actually moral behavior? So it doesn't always. Hey, good to see some of you guys. So let me pause here. Hey guys. So I didn't say hi to John from earlier, so hi to John. Hey Video Mania, good to see you in here. In Last Firebender as well. And Yin Yang Mountains, good to see you as well. So Yin Yang says this is ought. So just because a God is the case, a God ought to be the case. Yeah, I don't know if it has to do with that, because the ought here, so if you think of is, it's just a descriptive claim, and ought would be the normative claim. So the idea here is ought, that category of normativity, usually includes morality. It can include other things like etiquette behavior, like just because just because cats lick themselves and clean themselves in the crotchal area, right? I suppose we ought to do that as well as a form of etiquette at the dinner table. Like, that's just not going to happen, right? So just because it is the case, descriptively speaking, we see it in nature, doesn't mean it ought to be the case. And that's not even a moral ought. In that case, it would be an etiquette ought. So normativity can be either, you can have moral normativity, you can have etiquette normativity, you can have epistemic normativity. But yeah, it's a whole category of normative things. But all right, let's keep going. So let me look back through here to the responses board. And I skipped the first one. I'll go to that now because I think it's the best one. Now, feel free to raise up any objections or anything, but we went through modified divine command theory. We went through, this is also a religious response. Number 3 through 5 is your secular responses. So 1 is just to accept moral realism, that realism just is true apart from God. Or you can be a moral constructivist or relativist, or affirm some sort of evolutionary naturalism or something like that. All right. But I never got to number 1. So this is what this is. This is a classical theism response. The idea here is to split the horns. What are the horns? For anybody who's just getting here, these are the horns, right? The Euthyphro Dilemma comes from this. Is the good good because God wills it to be good? Right here, horn 1, like God is prior. It's a direction of causation question, right? So like, does God cause good to be good? I guess that would be this way. Does God cause good to be good? Or is the good first, is the good prior, and it's causing, I suppose, in some sense, causing God to recognize and acknowledge what goodness is, and affirm it. So horn 1, the problem is that if God is prior and he just says what things are good, then that seems arbitrary. That's what I have there in parentheses under number 1. Why couldn't he just say that torturing babies for fun is good? Or maybe saving all your money instead of donating it. That could be good instead. So it seems really arbitrary. If God's in charge, he could just decide whatever is good. Horn 2, the problem here is that if the goodness is prior, it sort of impugns or makes superfluous God's sovereignty. There's no reason, it almost makes him superfluous in the sense of like, if good is prior and God just kind of acknowledges goodness and he sort of stamps approval of it, says, okay, I acknowledge that. Like, what role was there for God to play? I suppose humans could have done the same. Like, goodness is good; it's independent of God. And then now you have something higher and more sovereign than God as well in this picture. So this is a problem. Both of them are problems for the Christian. This is a very common atheist puzzle that atheists like to present to the Christian. Now, it's a dilemma. It's a puzzle as to what the conclusion of this is supposed to be. I suppose atheists like to say that the conclusion is that God does not exist. I think that's a bit of a strong conclusion. I don't know how you get that because I don't see premises here that would lead to God just not existing or something. Yeah, so let's keep going. So I'll go to reply 1 now, splitting the horns. This is the classical theistic response. God is identical to goodness. So God is goodness itself, or God is identical with goodness. So second bullet point, goodness is not something external to God that God merely observes or conforms to, nor is goodness an arbitrary dictate of God's will. That avoids number 1. And it's not something external. That avoids number 2. Instead, God's very being, his essence, is goodness. So this response actually says, look, the dilemma is not a dilemma. It's a false dilemma. There's 3 options here. There's not just 2. It's not that, going back here, it's not that we have only where God is prior and he says what's good, or only the good that's prior and then God acknowledges that on horn 2. You have God and the good as just being identical. They just are the same thing. So let's go here. It deals with the first horn in this way, okay? So let me just read through this. God's commands flow from his nature, to unpack what this means. Excuse me. Because God is identical to goodness, his commands are not arbitrary whims. They are necessary expressions of his perfectly good nature. God cannot command something evil because it would be a contradiction of his own being. Just as a triangle cannot have 4 sides, God cannot be good and command evil. It's simply impossible. This response, identifying God with goodness, addresses horn 1, its charge of arbitrariness. So it addresses this in the following way. It directly refutes the idea that God's commands are arbitrary. They're not arbitrary. His commands are rooted in his immutable and perfect character. So torturing babies for fun can never be good because it's intrinsically contrary to God's loving, just, and compassionate nature, and it's something he just would never command. It's impossible for him to issue commands that are evil. It also addresses horn 2, the charge of independence. So first bullet point first, morality is dependent on God. Sure, it's not independent from it, but it's not arbitrarily dependent upon God. Morality is grounded in God's nature, as I say here, but it's not independent of God. It is dependent on God because it is God. God doesn't discover morality. He's not sitting over there just sort of acknowledging morality as this, and morality is a separate thing. God is the standard of morality. Morality is God. And so this addresses horn 2, right? The horn 2, the concern was, there was this separate thing, God, goodness, and God acknowledges it. So the concern here, as I say, what if God commands something because it's good? Then goodness must exist independently of God, this sort of independence thing. No, goodness does not exist independently. It is constituted by God's nature. So God doesn't command something because it's good and in a way that implies an external standard. Rather, he commands it because he is good, and his commands perfectly reflect that inherent goodness. All right, so let me get to a couple more questions if I haven't gotten to you yet. So let's see. All right, let's get to welcome Musashi. I think that's how you pronounce that. Good to see you here. I've never seen you before, so thanks for being here. So he asks, wouldn't the prescriptive force morality derive from propagation? So I think you're referring by propagation to something like evolutionary propagation, the idea of biological propagation of the species. And no, it would not, because we just dealt with that in number 5. If you look at this line which refers to the main challenges, the idea here is it is not, first of all, you can't derive an ought from it is. Just because animals engage in homosexual behavior, that doesn't mean that it's morally okay for humans to do it. Why? Well, just because animals engage in spiders eating their sexual mates does not mean it's okay for humans to do it. That's just a fallacy. It's called a naturalistic fallacy. And also, just because something is adaptive, evolutionarily adaptive, does not mean that it's morally good. It's evolutionarily adaptive for me to be a real jerk of a person if I run a business, be a cutthroat business owner, and just like step on everybody to get what I want. I will be enormously successful. I will be the fittest, right? Survival of the fittest, but it's not moral behavior, obviously. So we can't derive morality from evolution. Right here, morality is just whatever we've come up with. I dealt with that in number 4. Having problems with that. Several problems. You can't account for the universality of moral intuitions. You can't provide a basis for moral criticism across cultures. And you play a dangerous dance with nihilism, right? So if morality is just merely constructed, then ultimately nothing truly matters, right? So I could say more on that, and I have some videos on this as well. Okay, let me get some other questions here. So Yin Yang Mountain says this. At the end of the dialogue, didn't Socrates suggest to Euthyphro that they hadn't reached the conclusion and to continue or to try again? You're absolutely right. We will get to that. You're absolutely right. This is one of my favorite, actually, kind of episodes, the interplay between Socrates and Euthyphro. Euthyphro's a really young guy, and he's very boisterous, very cocksure and arrogant almost. And Socrates is wise, but he's very humble. I mean, he's witty and he's playful, and he makes jabs, intellectual jabs at Euthyphro, but he doesn't do it unprovoked. Like, Euthyphro definitely deserves it. And so it's funny to see, like, as a careful reader, you're not just kind of, you can read the Euthyphro in any Platonic dialogue in several different ways. You can read it just for like the pleasure of it. It reads just like a play, so it's like characters on a stage. That's an interesting, fun way to read it. You can read it for the depth and the philosophical concepts. And you can read it also just for the character development in terms of morality, right? So, like, this is similar to the first play, but you're not just reading it for enjoyment. You're also kind of analyzing the moral depth of these characters. And I do that a little bit later in this slideshow. I'd like to show you that. All right. So Yin Yang Mountain says, is God's nature good because God has it? Or does God have his nature because it's good? Neither. God just is goodness itself. God's nature is not apart from God. In fact, Aquinas says as much. So Aquinas has this saying that I don't know if it's his saying or the commentators on Aquinas use it as a kind of calling card thing, but they say that God's essence is identical to his existence, or the other way around, God's existence is identical to his essence. So God's very existence just entails that he has these attributes. So God, being God, entails that God is good. Now you might be like, well, I don't like that. That seems kind of cheating. But you know what? I'm not saying this with respect to you, Yin Yang Mountain, but other people might just say, well, that's cheating. God is just a fairy tale, or God is just a magician, or something like that. You'll hear this. I think those sorts of comments are really, really dismissive. And if atheists or skeptics or non-theists in general, if they really wanted to wrestle with the robustness of the intellectual tradition that is Christian philosophy and theology, then they would take these claims seriously, because this is what Christians claim, that God is identical. God's essence is identical to his existence. Like, so if I'm a skeptic and so I could just ignore it and like, I don't care. But if I wanted to get into these discussions, I couldn't just be dismissive. So I think it's just a matter of intellectual honesty. Now I'm not saying this with any respect to what comment was just on the screen, but I'm just saying this in general. All right. Where does this grounded nature come from? I don't know what you mean by that. I'm just going to answer this from within the tradition of Christian philosophy and theology. His nature just is his existence. So that would be like asking, where does God's existence come from? And the answer to that would just be that it's just always existed. Hey, Stray, it's good to see you. What makes you think things truly matter? So I'm not a constructivist about purpose or meaning. If I were a constructivist about purpose and meaning, if I said that, X, Y, and Z mattered, I would have a really hard time justifying why those things mattered at all. But I'll liken it. So it comes from God, obviously. As a Christian, I say that. But as I said in the previous stream, I liken it to the, very fashionable idea these days, the sort of simulation theory, right? So if the simulator makes us all, and we're just playing within the simulator's game, then it doesn't matter what little side task or whatever side quest I want to do in my life. What matters ultimately is what the simulator, what the designer of that simulation set it up to matter, right? And I'm just sort of beholden to that. So now I know that makes God sound mean, but we don't think that video game designers are mean. So okay, right here. So what could one say if an atheist claims that there's an id-ought fallacy that human ought to recognize God's goodness? It's a very good question. I'd like to get more like follow-up, like kind of questions on this and so on. I guess I'm kind of behind in the comments, but let me just I don't know if that's an is-ought fallacy necessarily. So the is, you have to wonder, like, what is the is and what is the ought? So just because you have a normative statement that you ought to do something doesn't mean that you have an is-ought fallacy. You have to, if you want to allege an is-ought fallacy, let's say, and it's good that you're anticipating an is-ought fallacy in this instance, but if you wanted to allege one, for example, a skeptic or an atheist wanted to allege a fallacy here, they would have to identify what both components are. What is the ought claim? And, well, you've identified it for them, that humans ought to recognize God's goodness. What is the is claim there? That humans do recognize God's goodness? That seems, I don't think anybody's trying to make that inference that just because humans do recognize that humans ought to recognize it. I don't know of anybody who makes an argument like that, or really anybody who sort of claims that. So yeah, that would be my recommendation, my advice is, like, just try to identify the components. Not every ought claim is going to be an is-ought fallacy. Okay, let's see this one. Locke. I like the name. Like John Locke. It reminds me of that character in Lost, the series. There was a guy named John Locke, and then there was a guy named Desmond Hume after David Hume, and it's a very philosophical series show. So he says here, if is God's nature good because it possesses certain attributes, or are those attributes good because they are part of God? This is similar to what Yin Yang Mountain had asked earlier. God's attributes simply are good because God is good, right? So, I mean, that's just that just like, that's like saying that so right there, I know some keyboard warriors are maybe getting on here because I think I slipped, but I made an adjectival claim based off a noun claim or an existence or a substance claim. So the idea here is the same with respect to, let me give you an analogy, that if you have heat, then something that derives from heat is just hot. So you have the noun, you have heat, and then you have something that's hot because it relates to heat, right? That's all we're saying about God's attributes. So I don't know if this question has any teeth to it. Not to dismiss it. I'm glad people are thinking about this, but all right, let's keep going. Yeah, so from the perennialist vantage point, the Euthyphro Dilemma is a false dichotomy because goodness is grounded in God's very essence or nature. Whatever God is by definition is the definition of good. Yeah, that's true. That would be the classical theistic view. Yeah, hey, thanks, Ace, man. Is a bit of a thorn in my side as you are sometimes. I really appreciate you always coming back. You always loving my library. You always being here for the streams, and you always saying things like this. So I appreciate that. Yeah, so definitely take a moment to hit the like button, share with others, and so on. Can I see a lot of people talking to each other, which is great. So, okay, cool. So let's keep going into this. So we addressed horn 1, we addressed horn 2. Let's summarize what we just did now. So think of an analogy. And again, starting with this underlined portion, God is identical to goodness. That's a classical theist response. So analogy is something like this, a perfect circle. Does the property of having no corners exist independently of the circle? And then the circle just conforms to that property of having no corners? Or, on the other hand, the other side of the dilemma, the other horn, does the circle arbitrarily decide to have no corners? No, neither one. Having no corners, the property of having no corners, is simply what it means to be a perfect circle. It's inherent to the nature of what a perfect circle is. Similarly, second bullet point, third, for classical Christian philosophers and theologians, goodness is inherent to God's nature. God doesn't conform to some external standard of goodness, nor does he arbitrarily invent goodness. He simply is the standard of goodness. He's goodness itself.